Imagine a private royal jewelry review at Buckingham Palace. A famous piece associated with Princess Diana is placed on the table. Camilla wants it considered for a future state occasion. William objects, and suddenly a discussion about a piece of jewelry becomes something much bigger. It becomes a question about Diana's legacy, royal ownership, and who gets to decide what happens to the objects that still carry her name. That is the fictional scenario we're exploring here. There is no verified evidence that William and Camilla had this confrontation, that William ordered a royal jewelry transfer, or that a secret palace meeting took place over Diana's jewels. But the history behind the scenario is real. And the real history is complicated. Because not every piece of jewelry Diana wore actually belonged to Diana. That distinction is essential. Some pieces were her personal property, others were royal heirlooms loaned to her, some came through the Spencer family, and others remained part of the royal collection. The public often remembers them all as Diana's jewelry. The legal and institutional history is much more complicated than that, and one famous tiara shows exactly why. The lover's knot tiara became one of Diana's most recognizable pieces. She wore it regularly during some of the most photographed years of her life. The pearls, the diamonds, the distinctive arches. People began associating the tiara so strongly with Diana that the object almost became part of her identity. But it wasn't her private property. The tiara was part of the royal collection and had been loaned to Diana. After her marriage ended, it returned to the collection. Years later, Catherine wore it. And that detail tells us something very important. A jewel can remain institutional property while becoming permanently associated with a particular person. Diana's connection to the lover's knot never disappeared simply because the tiara returned to the royal collection. Other pieces followed a very different path. Diana's sapphire engagement ring eventually went to William and was later given to Catherine. Her aquamarine ring went to Harry. Those were personal objects that became part of the private inheritance connecting Diana to her sons and, eventually, their families. That creates two completely different kinds of legacy. One is institutional, the other is personal, and the most interesting royal jewelry stories happen when those two worlds overlap. Now imagine a major state occasion is approaching. The royal household is reviewing jewelry that senior members of the family could wear. Some pieces are available through the royal collection, others aren't. Among them is a jewel strongly associated with Diana. The palace considers using it again. From an institutional perspective, that might seem completely normal. Royal jewelry has always moved between generations. Queens have worn pieces associated with earlier queens. Princesses have borrowed historic pieces. A jewel can become famous because of one royal and later be worn by another. That is part of how the collection works, but Diana's jewelry carries a different emotional weight. For the public, a jewel worn by Diana is rarely just an object. It's part of a photograph, part of a moment, part of a memory. So imagine Camilla appearing at a major state dinner wearing something everyone immediately associates with Diana. The palace could explain the provenance. It could point to the royal collection. It could say the piece has been used by members of the family for generations. Legally, that might settle the matter. Emotionally, it wouldn't. Within minutes, photographs of Camilla would be placed beside photographs of Diana. Commentators would start comparing them. The old history surrounding Charles, Diana, and Camilla would return, and an ordinary jewelry decision could suddenly become a royal controversy. That's where William enters the hypothetical story. For William, Diana is not simply part of royal history. She was his mother. That makes the issue much more personal. Imagine him being told that a piece closely associated with Diana could now be used as part of the working royal wardrobe. His reaction wouldn't necessarily be about ownership. It could be about meaning. There's a big difference between saying, "This belongs to me," and saying, "This carries a meaning that should be treated carefully." That is a far stronger position. And it also avoids one of the biggest problems with stories about Diana's jewelry, pretending that everything she ever wore belonged to her personally. It didn't. Take the lover's knot again. Diana made it famous, but the royal collection retained ownership. Catherine can wear it today without anyone pretending Diana's connection to it has disappeared. In fact, Catherine wearing it may be one of the clearest examples of how a royal object can carry one woman's memory into another generation. That is not the same thing as taking Diana's personal possessions and moving them into a broader royal collection. And that distinction would be central to our fictional dispute. Suppose William argues that every major Diana-associated jewel should first be classified. Which pieces were privately owned? Which were loans? Which came from the Spencer family? Which belonged to the royal collection? Which eventually passed to William and Harry? That would be a practical issue, not a theatrical confrontation. And it would actually make sense for the family, because the more time passes, the easier it becomes for public memory and legal ownership to get mixed together. People see Diana wearing a tiara and assume it was hers. They see another photograph and assume the same thing. But provenance tells a different story. And provenance matters, because without it, future generations could easily inherit myths instead of facts. Now imagine the palace discovering that the jewel at the center of the dispute falls into a complicated category. It may have been worn by Diana for years. The public may think of it as hers, but legally, it may belong to the royal collection. That immediately changes the argument. William cannot simply claim it as part of Diana's private inheritance. At the same time, Camilla's ability to wear it doesn't automatically mean the public will be comfortable with the decision. This is where the fictional scenario becomes genuinely interesting. There is no obvious villain. There are two different understandings of what the jewelry represents. Camilla could see an important historic royal object that should continue to serve the monarchy. William could see a piece whose public meaning has become inseparable from his mother. Both perspectives can exist at the same time, and that is what makes the conflict believable without inventing a dramatic palace fight. The real issue is interpretation. Who decides what a royal object means once history attaches itself to it? The royal collection can identify the legal owner, but nobody can control the emotional meaning the public gives the object. And Diana's jewelry carries an enormous emotional history. Some of the pieces were linked to her marriage. Some were associated with her humanitarian work. Some appeared in famous photographs. Some were simply part of her personal life. After her death, those objects became part of the story people tell about her. That is why William would have a reason to be cautious. Not necessarily because he wants every piece locked away, but because he knows that placing the wrong object in the wrong setting could reopen a chapter the palace thought had already settled. Now think about Catherine. She has already become one of the most important people in this story because she has worn jewelry associated with Diana. That creates a very different form of continuity. Diana wore the lover's knot. Catherine wears it now. The same piece crosses generations without pretending that Diana and Catherine are the same person. The jewelry becomes a bridge, and that may be the healthier way to think about royal heritage. Not every object has to belong privately to Diana's descendants to preserve her legacy. Sometimes the connection survives simply because the object continues to be treated with context. And this is where Charlotte becomes important too. Diana's grandchildren are growing up in a family where her memory remains very much alive. Some of the jewelry that connects them to her is already known. Other pieces may remain in private collections. Others will stay within the royal collection. As those children grow older, the question won't simply be who owns each jewel. It will be what each jewel represents. That is the real inheritance. Now imagine the hypothetical confrontation again. The jewelry case is open. A famous piece associated with Diana is on display. Camilla sees a chance to use it at an upcoming event. William believes the public meaning of the piece makes that decision more complicated. Instead of shouting across the room, he asks the palace to check the provenance. The records are examined. The history is established. The ownership becomes clear. That is a much more realistic source of conflict than inventing a secret royal decree. And it gives us something even more interesting. A battle between memory and institution. The institution asks, who owns it? The family asks, what does it mean? And the public asks, why is she wearing it? Those are three different questions, and all three could produce different answers. This is also why Diana's jewelry remains relevant nearly 3 decades after her death. The objects survived her. The photographs survived her. Her sons grew up. A new generation came along. And yet the jewelry can still instantly transport people back to Diana. That power doesn't come from diamonds. It comes from memory. And William will eventually inherit an institution where those memories are everywhere. He will have to deal with objects connected to his mother, his grandmother, his grandfather, his father, and previous generations of the royal family. Some will have complicated histories, some will be emotionally sensitive, some will have public associations that are much stronger than their legal status. That is the real challenge of royal heritage. The paperwork tells you what an object is. History tells you what it has become. And sometimes those aren't the same thing. There is another reason this conversation matters now. Diana remains a major subject of public interest, and that interest is not disappearing. Her brother, Charles Spencer, is preparing swan song, Diana, My Sister, a book about Diana's life and the way her story has been remembered. The book is scheduled for publication in September 2026. That means conversations about Diana's legacy are likely to return to the spotlight. Her marriage, her relationship with the royal family, her children, her possessions, and, inevitably, the jewelry that helped define her public image. So when a royal jewel appears in a new context, people don't just see the object, they see Diana. That is why a fictional confrontation between William and Camilla over one of those pieces can work as a story. But the strongest version isn't about William screaming at Camilla or secretly rewriting palace records. It's about a much more believable tension. Who should decide how Diana's physical legacy is used? William? The royal collection? The reigning monarch? Or the institution as a whole? The answer changes depending on the jewel. And that is exactly why the subject is so fascinating. Diana's engagement ring became part of William's family. Her aquamarine ring became part of Harry's. The lover's knot returned to the royal collection and eventually appeared on Catherine. Different objects followed different paths. That is not inconsistency. It is simply the result of different types of ownership. And perhaps that is the point William would ultimately want protected. The difference between a family heirloom and a royal heirloom. The difference between something Diana owned and something Diana borrowed. The difference between personal memory and institutional heritage. If that line remains clear, the family can preserve Diana's legacy without rewriting history. And that matters. Because once a jewel becomes attached to a story, the story can easily overwhelm the facts. A famous tiara becomes Diana's tiara. A necklace becomes Diana's necklace. A ring becomes part of a legend. And eventually, people forget who actually owned what. That is how history gets simplified. William's generation has the chance to prevent that. They can preserve the emotional connection while protecting the factual record. And that may be much more valuable than any dramatic public confrontation. Because Diana's legacy doesn't depend on every object staying in one family's hands. It depends on the history remaining alive. Her sons remember her. Her grandchildren know who she was. Catherine's use of some of the jewelry connects the past and present. The royal collection preserves pieces that belong to earlier generations. The Spencer family retains its own history. All of those strands can exist at the same time. And perhaps that is what a modern monarchy needs to understand. Royal heritage isn't static, it moves, objects move, titles move, families change, but memory moves with them. So imagine that jewelry case closing at the end of the day. No dramatic decree, no hidden legal transfer, no confrontation that nobody can prove happened, just a careful decision about where the object came from, who owns it, and how it should be used. That sounds much less explosive. But it leaves us with a much stronger question. What happens when the most emotionally powerful objects in the royal family belong partly to history and partly to memory? That is the problem William's generation will eventually have to solve. Because Diana's jewelry will outlive every current controversy. Camilla's role will change. Charles's reign will eventually end. William will become king. His children will grow up. But those objects will remain. They will continue appearing in photographs. People will continue recognizing them. And every time they do, Diana's story will return with them. So perhaps the real responsibility isn't protecting a jewelry box from another royal. It's protecting the history inside it. That is what gives these pieces their power. And that is what makes Diana's jewelry much more than decoration. It's a physical record of a family, a marriage, a generation, and a woman whose public image still shapes the monarchy decades later. So what do you think? Should Diana's most personal jewelry remain within the private inheritance of her children and grandchildren wherever possible? Or should historic pieces associated with her continue to be used by future members of the royal family as part of the wider royal collection? And where do you think the line should be drawn between Diana's personal legacy and the institution's royal heritage? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And subscribe for more royal family stories, because sometimes the most important royal battles aren't about crowns or titles. They're about what a family chooses to remember.